The human soldier staggered through the dense alien jungle, cursing under his breath. The crash had been brutal, and his ship was little more than a smoldering wreck. It had taken a good few hours just to get himself out of the tangled mess of metal and wires. He was sore, hungry, and most importantly, lost. His survival instincts kicked in, but he knew he had to keep moving if he didn't want to starve to death or become dinner for something out here. But the planet was a weird one, lush, thick with vegetation, yet eerily silent. The air was too still, and the fauna, there wasn't much of it, except for some strange, insect-like creatures that scurried out of his path every time he made a noise. "What the hell kind of planet is this?" he muttered, wiping the sweat off his brow. "Feels like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. One crash landing and I'm stuck in the middle of nowhere with no map, no supplies, and no damn clue." His radio was dead, his suit was busted, and even his trusty blaster was nothing more than a glorified paperweight. Just when he thought things couldn't get worse, a figure emerged from the undergrowth. At first, he thought it was another creature. Then, the figure stepped forward into the open, and he froze. It was her. The alien beauty. She was tall, impossibly elegant, and her skin shimmered like liquid silver in the pale sunlight. Her eyes, large, violet, were fixed on him with a cool, analytical gaze that didn't waver. She stood poised, as though she had all the time in the galaxy to observe him, and somehow, it felt like he had been the one intruding on her world, not the other way around. "Are you lost, human?" she asked, her voice calm, even, with a faint edge of curiosity. I'm not lost. Just taking a stroll," he replied, with the sort of cocky grin that could talk its way out of a black hole. "But if you're offering a ride home, I'd take that." Her lips curled slightly, though the expression didn't seem to reach her eyes. "I'm not offering anything, soldier. I'm here to ensure you don't make this situation worse." He scratched his head, staring at her. "Make the situation worse? Oh, sweetie, you have no idea what kind of trouble I can get into." His grin grew wider, though the prospect of being stuck on this unknown planet wasn't as exciting as he made it seem. Her gaze softened slightly. "I was sent to retrieve you. You are stranded, and there is no way out unless you come with me." "Retrieving me?" he asked, eyebrow raised. "You mean you were sent to babysit me?" "You could say that," she replied, her voice flat. "Come along quietly, and I will provide a way off this planet. The longer you stay here, the harder it will be to save you from your own recklessness." He chuckled, a low, self-assured sound. "Recklessness? That's my middle name, baby. You sure you're up for this?" She looked at him for a long moment, clearly unimpressed. "Human arrogance. A disease we've yet to cure." She turned her back and started walking, clearly expecting him to follow. He watched her for a moment, half amused, half intrigued by the way she moved, calm, controlled, confident. He had to admit, there was something mesmerizing about her. Her height alone was enough to make him feel slightly self-conscious. And then there was her skin, smooth, reflective, almost otherworldly. It wasn't just her beauty that caught him off guard, it was how little she seemed to care that he was there. There were no flirtations, no coy glances, no signs of being even remotely interested in him. She was here on business, and that was that. "So, you're just going to ignore the whole hot alien babe thing?" he called after her, flashing a grin. "I mean, I'd say I'm shocked, but you seem pretty immune to charm." She didn't even turn around. "Charm is useless if it's based on delusion. Your species tends to think you can talk your way out of everything. I find it inefficient." He couldn't help but laugh at her deadpan delivery. "Inefficient? Babe, you're talking to a guy who once convinced a whole army to retreat by singing them Kumbaya. You'd be amazed at what I can do with a little charisma and some absolutely questionable tactics." She paused, a single eyebrow twitching. "Singing? Yeah, don't act like you haven't heard of it. It's a crowd pleaser," he quipped. "But hey, if you're into direct approaches, we could always skip the charming and get straight to the wooing." The diplomat turned to him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I do not understand why your species feels the need to make everything a joke." He leaned in slightly, flashing that trademark grin. Joke? Sweetheart, this isn't a joke. I'm a treasure trove of human culture. Her violet eyes stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment, and he felt the heat of her gaze. You're a treasure, all right, she muttered under her breath, barely audible. He cocked his head. Did you just compliment me? Her lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. I did not. You must have misheard. Sure, he said, smirking. I'm hearing exactly what I want to hear. And then, as if she had been holding in a secret for millennia, she snorted. It wasn't a laugh, more like a strange sound that had accidentally escaped her mouth. But it was enough. He froze. Did you just? I did not laugh, she said immediately, her tone defensive, though there was a strange twinkle in her eyes. That was an error. Sure it was. He grinned widely. Look, I'm not judging you. You've been through a lot, and I get it. But girl, I just cracked the ice. You just laughed. I'm counting that as a victory. She stopped dead in her tracks, glaring at him. I did not laugh. You will not speak of this again. But it was already too late. The seed had been planted. The human soldier had successfully cracked the stoic diplomat's armor, and now, he had his mission, to get her to laugh again, and maybe, just maybe, he'd get more than that. The days dragged on, and the human soldier's initial optimism started to wear thin. The alien diplomat, while undeniably efficient, had all the warmth of a space ice cube. Every attempt he made at lightening the mood only seemed to bounce off her like blaster fire off a shield. At least she was still alive, and that was a small mercy. But he knew something had to give. By the third night of their sheltering together in the cave, he'd had enough of the awkward silence. He stretched out, staring at the fire with a mixture of boredom and frustration. You know, he began, keeping his tone casual. You're really starting to cramp my style, lady. The alien didn't even flinch, her eyes glued to the map she was studying. I'm not here to entertain you, human. My objective is to keep you alive until rescue arrives. Well, that's great, he said, draping one arm dramatically over his face. But I'm not sure how much longer I can survive this tension. He let out a deep sigh. I mean, seriously. A guy can only take so much of your Ice Queen routine before he starts cracking. I am not an Ice Queen, she replied, her voice flat. He groaned. I'm not asking for a concert, but you could at least crack a smile once in a while. Maybe a chuckle? A little giggle even? No? Nothing? She glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. Human humor is inefficient. It does not aid in survival. Sure, he said, not bothering to hide his sarcasm. And how's that working out for you so far? We're stranded on a hostile planet, freezing our asses off, and I'm pretty sure my only hope of surviving this is keeping myself entertained. So humor me. Please. You've heard of it, right? The diplomat sighed, clearly not convinced, but the smallest hint of curiosity flickered in her eyes. I do not see the necessity. He leaned forward, getting comfortable. Okay. What do you get when you cross a human soldier with a stranded alien diplomat? She stared at him blankly, not even the tiniest twitch in her expression. I mean, look at us, he continued, leaning back on his elbows, enjoying the sound of his own voice. Here you are, this perfectly poised alien diplomat, sent to rescue me, and then there's me, just your average, charmingly inappropriate human. You think I'm joking, but seriously, what does that add up to? A cosmic disaster waiting to happen. The silence stretched between them, and he was starting to think he might have to take it a step further. Come on, he pressed, flashing his signature grin. You've got to give me something. What about a little laugh? I bet you have a wicked sense of humor hiding behind that diplomat face. I'm like a magnet for it. She stared at him for a moment, processing. And then, against all odds, she let out a huff of air, more of an exhale than anything. But it was progress. Ha! He said, grinning wider. That's it. I heard it. A laugh. A real one. He pointed dramatically at her. Mark this day, because you just cracked. The diplomat's face remained stern. I did not laugh. Yeah, he said, waving his hand dismissively. Sure you didn't. That was a laugh, and I'm counting it. Small victories. I am not amused, she said, almost too seriously. Well, then you're missing out, he said with a shrug. You know what's the real tragedy here? A beautiful, intelligent diplomat like you, and you've never really had a good laugh. Not one that wasn't because of some diplomatic faux pas or alien etiquette mishap. A real laugh. I bet you're not even sure how to do it, huh? Her eyes narrowed again, but this time, he saw a flicker of something. It wasn't annoyance. It wasn't confusion. It was something else entirely. Curiosity, maybe? A slight shift in her perfectly composed demeanor. You are frustrating, she said, but the words didn't hold the same bite. He knew he was getting to her. Yeah, that's kind of my charm, he replied, grinning. You wouldn't believe how many people find me irresistible when I'm being frustrating. And hey, you've got to admit, I'm better company than that cold, unfeeling rock you were hanging out with before I showed up. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes lingering on him longer than before. She was considering it. This was progress. You find yourself irresistible? She asked, her tone dipping into dry sarcasm. It wasn't much, but it was the first sign of a joke, even if it wasn't a compliment. Damn straight, he said, leaning back, completely unfazed. It's the undeniable charm of the human race. It's how we survive out here. You should try it. I've got a whole arsenal of techniques I can teach you, if you're willing to learn. For a moment, she didn't respond, her gaze turning to the fire. He thought maybe he had gone too far, until she spoke again, quietly. Teach me what? Her voice was no longer the cold, diplomatic tone he'd become accustomed to. It was softer, just a little less certain. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The art of laughing, of course. You want to survive this, learn to laugh. Learn to let go. You've got all that brilliant logic in that head of yours, but you can't let that take over everything. You've got to embrace the chaos sometimes. Her brow furrowed. Chaos? Yup, he said with a smirk. Chaos. Trust me, it's a vital survival skill. And while I'm at it, I'll teach you how to tell a dirty joke. You'd be amazed how quickly you'll start smiling when you're laughing at the right things. She seemed to mull it over for a moment. The tiniest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It wasn't much, just a flicker, but it was there. You really think I will laugh at your jokes? She asked, her voice still flat, but with a slight edge of challenge. Oh, I know you will, he said confidently. I'll even start easy. What do you call a human who survives a crash landing on a planet filled with dangerous fauna and no supplies? I don't know, she replied, completely deadpan. A genius, he said, winking. Because only a genius would make it this far while looking as good as I do. She blinked once, twice. The words hung in the air for a long, unbearable moment. Then, finally, she let out an almost imperceptible chuckle. It was a tiny sound, no more than a breath, but it was there. He froze. Did you just? He began, half disbelieving. I did not laugh, she said quickly, though it didn't have the usual finality. He grinned, triumphant. I heard it. You laughed. Consider it a victory. Now we just need to work on your timing, and we're set. For the first time, she didn't protest. Instead, she gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And he knew, right then, that this was only the beginning. The days following their brief exchange were quieter, but something had shifted between them. The human soldier could feel it. There was less tension in the air, less of that ice-cold aura that the diplomat had carried around like armor. It wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but there was something warmer now. Like a tiny crack in the fortress of her mind. She hadn't laughed again, but he was starting to see glimpses of a different side of her, a side that, if he played his cards right, might just crack wide open. She had become more engaged in their conversations, responding to his jabs with a little more bite, a little more wit. It wasn't much, but he could tell she was trying. In her own way, she was learning. Learning how to laugh, how to connect, how to feel. And he wasn't going to stop until she got it. One evening, while they were sitting by the fire, he decided to test her progress. He was feeling a little bolder tonight, and he had a new angle. It was time for something a little more personal. "I've got a riddle for you," he said, casually tossing a rock into the fire. "It's a human classic. You're gonna love it." She glanced up from the datapad she had been studying, raising an eyebrow. "A riddle? Oh, yeah? It's a classic," he replied with a grin. "What do you call two humans who are stuck on a desolate planet, with no way out and no one else around?" She didn't bite immediately. She just stared at him, waiting for him to continue. "Come on, you gotta take a guess," he pushed. "I'll give you a hint, this one's about us." She looked at him, clearly annoyed by his persistence. "I'm sure I have no idea." He smiled. "The answer is a couple of idiots." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. It was as if he'd told her that the sky was blue or that water was wet. He threw his hands up in mock frustration. "Come on, that was a good one. Seriously, I'm trying here. You can't just stare at me like I've been replaced by a hologram." She blinked, slowly processing what he said. Then, to his shock, she actually rolled her eyes. "You are infuriating, human." "Ah, but you're still talking to me." He gave her a triumphant smile, feeling like a dog who just brought his owner a bone. "See? Progress." "I am not amused," she said, a deadpan reply. But even that didn't quite have the usual force behind it. She sounded tired? Maybe resigned? "Oh, I'm sure you'll get there," he said, unfazed. "You know, I've been thinking. You've got a really dry sense of humor. A little too dry, honestly. But that's okay, I'm here to help. I'll show you how to really bring out your inner comedian." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "And you believe you are qualified to teach me humor? Why not? I've got years of experience in making people laugh, or at least in embarrassing myself so badly that others can't help but laugh at me," he said with a shrug. "Trust me, it's an art form. You are insufferable," she muttered, looking back down at her datapad. But there was no edge to her words. It was more like she was resigned to the fact that he wasn't going to stop talking, ever. And that realization seemed to loosen something inside her. For the first time, she wasn't trying to shut him down. "Oh, I'm just getting started," he teased, leaning forward. "But here's the thing. I think you've been taking this whole diplomat thing a little too seriously. I mean, come on. You've been stuck with me for days. You've got to have some kind of wild side, right?" Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't say anything. I know, he continued. "You're probably thinking, human, I am far too cultured for your nonsense. And I get that. But there's one thing I know for sure, you need to laugh. And I'm here for that mission." She sighed, clearly exasperated, but something in her eyes softened. "Why do you insist on this?" He leaned in closer, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Because you need it. Look, I know you're all about logic and peace and all that, but the universe doesn't care about logic when things start to go wrong. You'll be stuck in your head all the time, calculating outcomes, wondering about what's best, what's most efficient. And while you're stuck there, the universe keeps moving, and people, humans like me, keep laughing." She stared at him, silent, processing his words. The look in her eyes was different now, a little less cold. There was a flicker of something there, maybe curiosity, maybe hope. She had been trained to think in terms of strategies, of peace and order, but none of that worked when you were stranded on a planet, with a human who refused to let anything go. "I've seen your kind before," she said softly, her voice almost melancholic. "The ones who find humor in everything, who laugh even when the situation is dire. I don't understand how you can live that way." He leaned back, looking up at the stars. "It's the only way to survive. You think I like being stuck on this planet with no way out? Hell no. But if I let it get to me, if I let the stress take over, I'm done for. Laughter is the only thing that keeps me sane. She was quiet for a long time, her eyes drifting to the fire. Finally she spoke, her voice quieter than usual. Is that why you joke so much? To distract yourself from the fear? His grin faltered for just a second, and he turned to look at her, his expression softer now. You could say that. Sometimes a joke is all we've got. There was silence between them again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was peaceful, almost. She sat there, thinking, and he let her. After all, he wasn't going to rush this. He knew that what he was trying to teach her wasn't something you could force. It had to come naturally. A few minutes passed, and she looked back up at him, her eyes still guarded but not as distant as before. Tell me another one. He raised an eyebrow. Another joke? Yes. Another one, she repeated, this time with just a hint of curiosity in her tone. He grinned. All right, here's one for you. Why did the human bring a ladder to the bar? She blinked at him. I do not know. Why? Because he heard the drinks were on the house, he said, his grin wide as he waited for her reaction. There was a long pause, and for a moment, he thought he had lost her again. Then, to his surprise, her lips twitched. It wasn't much, just the tiniest curl of the corners, but it was there. He leaned forward. Wait, did you just… I did not laugh, she said quickly, but the glint in her eyes betrayed her. Oh, I'm counting that one, he said triumphantly. We're getting there. She didn't argue. Instead, she simply nodded, her gaze a little warmer now. The change was small, but it was undeniable. And just like that, he knew, the human soldier had finally made a dent in the cold exterior of the alien diplomat. The laughter was the first crack. And now, it was only a matter of time before everything else started to fall apart, beautifully, hilariously, and irreparably. The next morning, everything felt different. The air was charged with an undercurrent of something new, something unspoken. The soldier could sense it, even before he saw her. The alien diplomat was no longer the same unyielding, emotionless figure she had been when they first met. She wasn't entirely soft, not yet, but the walls around her were starting to show cracks. And that was enough for now. As he stirred the fire, she approached him, her usual composure almost intact, almost. There was a slight shift in her posture, something more open, like she was inviting something new into her life, even if she didn't fully understand it. Good morning, he greeted her, flashing a grin that was equal parts mischievous and genuine. Feeling better today? She didn't immediately respond. Instead, she eyed him carefully, as if weighing her words, before finally saying, I've been thinking about your laughter theory. He raised an eyebrow. Oh, really? I wasn't sure you'd come around. You know, most diplomats would just try to ignore me by now. I'm impressed. Her lips quirked up slightly, but she quickly masked it. It's not about your jokes, human. It's about the logic behind them. He chuckled, shaking his head. If you're looking for logic in my sense of humor, you're not gonna find it. There's no system here, just chaos. But hey, chaos is its own kind of logic, don't you think? I don't, she said, her tone still flat but no longer as harsh as it used to be. But I'm starting to understand why you do it. He put down the stick he had been using to poke at the fire and turned to her, his eyes narrowing in amusement. Are you saying I've converted you into one of my loyal followers? You'd make an excellent disciple, you know. She gave him a look that could almost be called a smirk. I would not go that far. Yeah, he said with a wave of his hand. But seriously, you're getting there. I knew you had it in you. She glanced at the horizon for a moment, and for the first time, he noticed her hesitation. She was still unsure about something. I don't understand why this matters so much to you, she admitted, the rare vulnerability in her voice taking him by surprise. Why do you keep pushing this humor on me? He sat up straighter, his usual playful demeanor shifting to something more serious, though still light. Because it's the thing that keeps me sane, you know? It's not just about jokes or laughs. It's about surviving the things you can't control. You can plan, you can strategize, you can fight, but at the end of the day, sometimes all you've got left is the ability to laugh at the chaos. If you can do that, you're never truly defeated. She stared at him, processing his words. He could tell it was a foreign concept to her, this idea that humor was survival. But for him, it was everything. I don't think I've ever been in a situation where I needed humor to survive, she said quietly, almost to herself. Yeah, well, I've been in a lot of them, he replied with a half-smile. I can tell you, the only thing that gets me through the day is cracking a joke and knowing that things could be worse. Humor makes everything feel a little less hopeless. She seemed to be absorbing the weight of his words, her expression thoughtful. You really believe that? I do, he said, his voice firm but gentle. And maybe you'll come to believe it too. There was a pause between them, as if the moment had stretched into something more than just another conversation. It felt like a quiet turning point, like they were both on the edge of something that neither of them had fully understood until now. He broke the silence, his usual grin returning. All right, enough of the serious talk. Let's lighten things up. He raised his hand like he was about to make a grand announcement. So, do you want to hear a dirty joke? She shot him a look that was both suspicious and intrigued. A dirty joke? Oh yeah, he said with a gleam in his eye. Get ready. She crossed her arms, clearly skeptical. I'm not sure I'm interested in hearing about your human anatomy. Not that kind of dirty joke, he protested, though he was clearly enjoying her discomfort. Come on, lighten up. It's all in good fun. She raised an eyebrow, clearly unwilling to admit that she was even slightly intrigued, but still, he could see the glimmer of curiosity in her eyes. All right, he said. So a human walks into a bar with a piece of sandpaper under his arm. She stared at him, unamused. That is not funny. He shrugged. I'll take that as a compliment. But listen, this is the important part. The bartender asks him, "What are you doing with that sandpaper?" And the human says, "Just here for the roughest drink in the house." The silence that followed could have been a full minute for all he knew. Then, finally, he saw it, the tiniest twitch of her lips. It was subtle, but it was there. And it was more than enough. You smiled, he said, leaning forward with exaggerated excitement. I knew it. I knew you had it in you. I did not smile, she said quickly, but the way her eyes flickered to the ground told him everything he needed to know. She couldn't quite suppress the faintest grin. You totally did, he said, practically crowing with triumph. I'm counting that as a win. I do not see why this is so important to you, she said, but her voice had softened considerably. You find success in my small reactions? Oh yeah, he said, leaning back on his hands with a satisfied grin. Every tiny victory counts. You can't just keep measuring everything by how much damage it does or how quickly you can fix things. Sometimes it's about those little moments of connection. Like this one. You laughed. Well, smiled, but it's the same thing. It's progress. She stared at him for a long time, then spoke, her voice almost a whisper. You know, you're maddening. But you're also not as insufferable as I thought. He winked at her. Hey, I'll take that as the highest compliment I've ever received. She snorted, and for the briefest moment, he thought it might be a full-out laugh. Instead, it was just a quick, involuntary sound, something between an exhale and an amused cough. But it was still more than anything he had ever expected. He knew he was getting through to her. The cracks were deepening, the walls around her starting to collapse, one joke at a time. And for the first time since they had met, he realized that, perhaps, this wasn't just about teaching her to laugh or helping her see the lighter side of things. Maybe it was about something deeper. About learning how to let go, how to be human, how to care, how to love. We're getting there, he said quietly, almost to himself, as he sat back and watched her, a tiny smile playing on her lips. For the first time in a long while, the soldier felt like he wasn't alone.